She walked into the restaurant on her 25th wedding anniversary, and found another woman sitting in her chair, laughing at something her husband had just said. It was 7:15 on a Thursday in February, the kind of Toronto evening where the snow has already turned grey at the curbs, and everyone comes through the door stamping their boots. Iris Kavanagh stood just inside the entrance with her coat still buttoned. She had come straight from the junction. There was still a smear of machine oil on her thumb she hadn't managed to get off in the car. The hostess had said the table was already seated. Iris had smiled and said thank you, because she'd assumed that meant Desmond had arrived early for once. He had. The table was in the corner by the window, the one he always requested because he liked to be able to see the room without the room seeing him first. Her husband, Desmond Kavanagh, sat with his back to her, one hand resting on the stem of a wineglass. Across from him in the chair Iris had sat in every year since their 10th anniversary was a woman in a dark green dress. She was maybe 30. Her hair was down. She had her elbows on the table like she'd done it 100 times before. Iris did not move. The matriarch came over with the menus folded against his chest and something apologetic already forming on his face. He'd been there 11 years. He knew her. Mrs. Kavanagh, he said quietly. The reservation was under the doctor's name. It said too. It usually does, Iris said. She looked at the table again. There was a small card standing at the center. Cream stock, the restaurant script. Dr. Kavanagh +1. She had ordered that card herself 3 weeks ago, over the phone, on hold for 11 minutes, because she'd wanted the anniversary to feel like something. She was the +1 at her own anniversary. The woman in the green dress said something and Desmond laughed. Iris knew the exact temperature of that laugh. It was the one from the early years, loose and surprised. The laugh he used to make when she said something dry over a bad dinner in their first apartment. She had not heard it in the kitchen in a very long time. Then he turned. Perhaps he felt the draft from the door. Perhaps some part of him had been waiting. His face went through it fast. Confusion, recognition. Then something that looked almost like relief, and that was the part Iris would think about for months afterward. Lying awake, turning it over. Relief, as if a weight had been set down. He stood up so quickly the wineglass rocked. Iris. She did not raise her voice. She did not walk over. She did not look at the woman in the green dress. Not once, not even to memorize her. She took off her wedding ring. It came off harder than she expected. 25 years of the same finger. She had to work it over the knuckle. And it took long enough that Desmond had time to come halfway across the dining room. And long enough that a few people at nearby tables understood something was happening and became very interested in their bread. She set the ring on the Mistress' little podium next to the reservation book. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the other thing. It was a hair clip, surgical steel plane, the kind that used to hold a scrub cap in place. Desmond had given it to her in 1997 after his first solo aortic repair, when he'd had exactly $40 in his account and no idea what a gift was supposed to look like. She had worn it every day for 6 years and kept it for 19 more. She laid it beside the ring. Iris, Desmond said again. He was close now. Iris, please, let me explain. She looked at him. It surprised her how little she wanted to hurt him. She had expected fury. What she felt instead was something older and heavier. Something like standing at the edge of a lake in November and understanding calmly that the season was simply over. I'm not going to ask you how you could, she said. Iris, that's a question for a woman who still needs an answer. She buttoned the top button of her coat. I have the answer, Desmond. I've had it for about 4 years. I just kept setting it down because it was heavy. Behind him the woman in the green dress had stood up and was gathering her purse with the particular clumsiness of a person who has just discovered she is not the main character. Iris turned and walked out. Desmond followed her onto the sidewalk with no coat on. The wind coming up from the lake was mean that night. Salt crunched under her boots. She had parked around the corner because the valet always took too long and she'd wanted the walk, wanted the 2 minutes of anticipating her own anniversary dinner. You're not even angry, he said, catching up to her, breathing hard. Iris, say something, yell at me. Because you're supposed to. His voice cracked on it. He heard it crack. He hated that. Because that's what. She stopped and looked at him properly, and something in her face made him stop too. You didn't lose me tonight, she said. You lost me on every night I stopped in the middle of a sentence because you'd picked up your phone, and I decided it wasn't worth finishing. That's not fair, no, Iris agreed. It isn't. She got in the car. He stood in the slush in his good shoes and his shirt sleeves, a 59-year-old man, who had reconstructed the hearts of 1,100 people, watching his wife check her mirror, signal, and pull out into traffic like a woman with somewhere to be. Which, as it turned out, she did. The house in Rosedale was dark when he got back. Not empty. Dark. He kept turning on lamps as if that would help. Her coat closet was mostly full. That was the part that frightened him. She had taken a suitcase and a garment bag and left the winter parka she wore to the market, the boots with the salt stains, the ordinary things. She had chosen nothing about it was panic. He called her at 11:40. Voicemail. He called again at 12:15 and listened to the whole of her recorded greeting. The one he'd heard 1,000 times without ever once hearing it. "You've reached Iris, leave it after the tone and I'll get back to you." Her voice on the recording was cheerful, slightly rushed, alive. He didn't leave a message. He couldn't think of a single sentence that wasn't insulting in its smallness. At 2 in the morning he found himself standing in her study, which he had walked past perhaps 10,000 times. He had never really been in it. It was a small room off the back staircase, the room the previous owners had used for storage. He'd assumed she used it for household paperwork, property taxes, charity boards, the sort of thing that happened around the edges of his life while he was busy at the center of it. There was a desk, a drafting lamp, a whiteboard with lines of small precise handwriting he could not read from across the room, and did not cross the room to read, because a strange dread was gathering in him and he wasn't ready to name it. On the shelf there was a photograph in a plain black frame. He picked it up. It was from 1996, taken in the staff corridor at St. Aldwyn's. 3 people in scrubs, him in the middle, 29 years old, all cheekbones and arrogance and a fresh coffee stain on his collar. On the right, Owen Trask, who'd been chief resident and would later be chief of surgery. On the left, a scrub nurse with her cap slightly crooked and her hands loose at her sides. He turned the frame over, because something was written on the backing paper in pencil. The one on the left was holding the clamp. He set the photograph down, then he picked it up and read it again. He didn't understand it yet, not really. But he sat down in her chair, which was not comfortable, which was the chair of someone who worked rather than someone who rested. And he stayed there until the sky over the ravine turned the color of dishwater. 9 years before that photograph was taken, Iris Sunderland came to Toronto from Antigonish with 2 suitcases and a nursing diploma and no plan beyond the next paycheck. She was the daughter of a boat mechanic. She'd spent her childhood handing her father wrenches in an unheated shop that smelled of diesel and cold rope. Learning without noticing that a machine is only ever an argument between forces, and that most arguments can be settled if you can see where the load is going. Her father used to say a thing about that. You don't fight the load, you find out where it wants to go and you put steel there. She thought about that sentence more often over the years than she thought about almost anything else. She was good at the oar immediately. Some people are. She had the hands and, more importantly, she had the eyes. She could see 2 moves ahead of the surgeon, and she'd have the instrument turned and in his palm before he finished asking. The old surgeons loved her. The young ones didn't notice her at all, which suited her, because it meant she could watch them. Desmond Kavanagh, she noticed everyone did. He came up through St. Aldwyn's the way weather comes across the lake, visible from a long way off. Brilliant, they said, and he was. Also exhausted, also frightened, also very young in a way he was working extremely hard to disguise. The night that mattered was a Sunday in March 1996. A ruptured aneurysm came in at 2 a.m. The attending was 40 minutes out in a snow squall on the 401. Desmond had assisted on 9 of these, he had never led one. Iris was scrubbed in. She remembered the light, the particular flat blue of the overheads, the sound of the suction. She remembered that the anesthetist was humming badly. And she remembered the exact moment Desmond's hands stopped, not shook. Stopped. He was standing over an open chest with a clamp in his fingers and the field filling faster than the suction could clear it. And he had simply run out of body. His eyes came up over the mask and found hers, and they were the eyes of a boy. She did not say it's all right. It was not all right, she said. 2 centimeters proximal above the tear. I'm going to hold pressure and you're going to put it there, he said. I can't see it. You don't need to see it, I've got it. Follow my thumb. He followed her thumb. She held the field for 11 minutes with her hands inside a stranger's chest, while a 29-year-old surgeon rebuilt an aorta. And when it was over and the anesthetist said the pressure was climbing, Desmond stepped back from the table and looked at her over the drape, like she had made the sun come up. The attending arrived at 3:50 and said, "Christ, Kavanagh." Not unkindly, admiringly. The case went into the department's morbidity review as an example. The following year it was written up in a journal Iris never read. Desmond's name was on it. The nurse's name was not, because nurses' names are not, because that is how it has always been, and nobody in that room, including Iris, thought to object. He asked her out 4 days later in the cafeteria, holding a tray with nothing on it but a coffee. He was so nervous he spilled it. "I don't have anything to offer you," he said. "Genuinely. I have debt and a bad car. I've seen the car, so that's a no." Iris took the coffee out of his hand and set it down so he'd stop shaking it. "It's a Thursday," she said. "I'm off at 6. She married him 13 months later in a church in Antigonish with 41 people in it, and her father crying in the second pew. Their first apartment was above a hardware store on DuPont, and the radiators knocked so hard in January that they used to say goodnight to them. They had a table that folded out from the wall. Desmond spread his cases across it and Iris sat opposite with her feet in his lap and listened, and then said the thing he hadn't thought of. That was the shape of it, in the beginning. He talked, she listened. Then she found the load. He'd describe a repair that kept failing and she'd say, "You're clamping too far from the anastomosis. The tension's coming back on the suture line the second you release," and he'd stare at her. How do you know that? Because I've watched you close 200 of them. She'd say, and you keep making the same face at minute 9. He wrote things down. In those years he wrote everything down. He credited her too in the beginning. My wife thinks. He'd start, at dinners, and the older surgeons would look at Iris with real interest and ask her a question, and she would answer it, and Desmond would sit back with his arms folded, and a look on his face like a man watching his own horse come in. She has tried to identify the exact year that stopped. It didn't stop. It faded the way the wallpaper in that first apartment faded. So gradually you'd have to hold a photograph up against the wall to prove it had ever been read. Somewhere in the late 90s she went part-time. Then when he took the chief's job she left the hospital entirely. Because it was awkward. Everyone agreed it was awkward. A nurse in the department her husband ran. It made sense. It was the right decision. She said so out loud several times, to several people, in the tone of a woman convincing herself. She was 36 years old, and she went home and there was nothing in the house that needed her. The rise was not one moment. It was 100 small elevations, each of which Desmond experienced as a thing he had earned. And Iris experienced a room she was being moved further to the back of. Better hospital. Then a research chair. Then the clinic on Bloor with his name in brushed steel on the wall. Then a foundation. Then a documentary crew in their kitchen for 2 days, filming him talking about the aneurysm case from 1996. Which by then had a shape and a rhythm, which by then was a story he told rather than a night he'd survived. Iris watched the rough cut in the screening room with her hands folded. The attending was stuck on the highway, Desmond said on screen. I looked around that room and I realized nobody was coming. It was me or nobody. There was footage of the operating theater. There was a shot of a nurse's gloved hands. They were not her hands, they were a reenactment. They belonged to an actress from Etobicoke. Afterward the producer asked Iris what she'd thought, and Iris said it was very well made. Desmond squeezed her hand and said to the producer, my wife's been enormously supportive. Supportive. That was the year she started to notice the word. Once she noticed it she heard it everywhere. Nobody had ever called Owen Trask supportive. Supportive was what you said about weather that stayed out of the way. There was a dinner in 2018, at the chief's house, 12 people around a table. A young cardiologist named Nadia asked a real question about a device trial. And Iris, who had read the trial protocol 3 times because it was sitting on the counter and she reads everything, answered it. She said the trial was underpowered for the subgroup they cared about. And that the exclusion criteria had been written by someone protecting a result, rather than looking for one. And that if the sponsors were serious they'd have stratified by vessel caliber. The table went quiet. Not the awkward quiet. The other one. The one where a room recalibrates. Owen Trask put down his fork and said, say that again. And Desmond laughed loudly. He put his arm around the back of Iris's chair. Careful, he said. Ask her another question and she'll be scrubbing in. The table laughed with him. It was a good line. Nadia's face did something complicated and then she turned to the man on her left. In the car Iris said, why did you do that? Do what? You know what? Desmond signaled, changed lanes, did not look at her. You were getting into something you don't have the background for. I was doing you a favor. I read the protocol, Iris. He said her name the way you'd close a drawer. Can we not turn this into a whole thing? She looked out the window at Bayview going past the salt white road, the black trees. She said no, we can't. He took it as agreement. He was pleased with her actually for the rest of the drive. He put his hand on her knee at a red light. She let him. Sloane Merrick came into their lives holding a binder. She was a regional director for a device company, 31 years old, and she was very good at her job. And her job was largely the management of surgeons' vanity. Desmond met her at a conference in Banff in the spring of 2021. The affair did not begin with anything you could photograph. It began with the way Sloane Merrick listened. When Desmond spoke she stopped moving. She held eye contact a half-second longer than the room required. When he said something ordinary she said, say more about that. When he told the 1996 story, and he told it to her within 11 minutes of meeting her, she put down her drink and said, God, you must have been terrified. And he said, I was. He had not said that to Iris in 25 years. It had never occurred to him that Iris might not already know, or that knowing was not the same as being told. That was the whole of it, really. A man does not leave a woman for a younger woman's face. He leaves for a younger woman's attention, which has the enormous advantage of being new, and which arrives without any memory of him being frightened, broke, ordinary or wrong. Sloane Merrick had never seen him wrong. To her he had come pre-assembled, eminent, silver, certain, the surgeon on the documentary. She admired the finished object. Iris had built it and therefore knew where the seams were. And after a while a man can begin to experience his wife's knowledge of him as an insult. Iris knew before she knew. She knew it the way you know a bearing is going in a machine. A hum slightly off pitch months before anything fails. The second phone always face down. The gym membership at 57. The shirts that came home smelling of a hotel's soap, which is a smell like nothing on earth, chemical and floral and cold. The way he stopped arguing with her. That was the worst of it. He used to argue. Now he agreed with everything she said in a light, courteous, faraway voice. The voice of a man being polite to a stranger on a train. She did not follow him. She did not go through his coat. She had watched enough repairs to know that when you go looking for a leak with your bare hands, you usually only prove you can't stop it. Instead, she went out to the garage, in November, and turned the light on. There was a workbench out there that had come from her father's shop in Antigonish. She had shipped it up when he died in 2009, and Desmond had said kindly, "Whatever you want, sweetheart," and never asked about it again. On that bench under a canvas were the drawings. She had started them the year she left the hospital. It began as something to do with her hands. A vascular clamp, but wrong. The jaw articulated on 2 axes instead of 1, so that the load distributed along the vessel wall instead of concentrating at the tips. She had spent 9 years watching aortas tear at the clamp site. Her whole professional life, she had watched steel put pressure where the tissue didn't want it. You don't fight the load. You find out where it wants to go, and you put steel there. She'd machined the first prototype in 2011 in a rented shop in the Junction, on a Tuesday, with a 19-year-old apprentice named Dev who thought she was somebody's mother. It didn't work, neither did the next 4. The 6th one worked. She did not tell Desmond. She has thought a great deal about why, and the honest answer is not noble. She didn't tell him because she was afraid he'd be kind about it. She could picture, with unbearable clarity, his face doing the thing it did, the warm, patient, terrible face, and him saying, "That's wonderful, Iris, that's really something," and then asking her on the way to the car, whether she'd called about the roof. So she said nothing, and a small silence. "If you leave it alone, will build itself a house." She filed the patent in 2013 under Iris Sunderland, which was still her legal name on the nursing license she'd never surrendered, and which she chose because the lawyer asked and she heard herself say it before she'd decided. She incorporated in 2015. She called it Halyard Medical, after the rope on her father's boat, the one that hauls a thing up the mast where it can be seen. She hired an engineer named Priya Nandakumar, who was 26 and terrifying, and a machinist, and later a regulatory lead, and then 11 more people. She rented the 2nd floor of a brick building on Sterling Road with radiators that knocked, which made her happy in a way she did not examine. They cleared Health Canada in 2017 and the FDA the year after. By 2023 the clamp was in 406 hospitals in North America. Surgeons called it a halyard, as in, "Hand me a halyard." They said it the way you say a word that has always existed. None of them knew who she was. She went to the tragus. She stood at the booth in a navy blazer and answered questions, and men in suits explained her own device back to her, and she said, "That's exactly right," and let them. The thing nobody understood afterward was that she wasn't hiding. She simply stopped offering. There is a difference, and it took Desmond a very long time to find it. 3 years before the anniversary, on a night when he didn't come home until 1, she wrote something on a page in a black notebook that lived in the drawer of the drafting desk. She wrote it because she couldn't sleep, and because writing a thing down sometimes makes it stop circling. "This is not about him. I'm not doing this to be discovered. I only want to stop living in the corner of a life I helped build, folding myself smaller every year so there's room for the furniture." She never showed it to anybody. She never intended to. He found the truth 11 days after she left, and he did not find it by snooping. And he did not find it because she was careless. He found it the way the world usually delivers its verdicts. Through an email from an accountant on a Tuesday afternoon. The clinic was renewing its device licensing agreements. There was a package for exclusivity with the manufacturer of the clamp they used in every aortic case, and the CFO needed the medical director's signature, and there were 4 schedules attached, and Desmond opened the 3rd one because he opens everything. Halyard Medical Inc. Licensor. Patent held by I. Sunderland. He read it. He put the laptop down on the desk and walked to the window and stood there for a while, and then he came back and read it again. Then he did the thing that would humiliate him later, when he'd had time to think about it. He searched the company. He wanted badly for it to be a coincidence. Sunderland is not an uncommon name. There is a Sunderland Road in Etobicoke. The website had a leadership page. It loaded slowly and then it did not load slowly enough. She was in a navy blazer, her hair was back. She looked directly at the camera with an expression he had never once seen her wear at any table he had ever sat across from her at, which was an expression of complete and unbothered authority. Iris Sunderland, founder. He called Owen Trask. Owen was 71 and retired and answered on the 2nd ring. And Desmond could hear a hockey game somewhere behind him. "Did you know?" A pause. Not a confused one, a careful one. The hockey game got quieter. Owen had gone into another room. "Yes," Owen said. Desmond's hand had closed around the edge of the desk. "How long?" "I've been on their clinical advisory board since 2019. He stopped. He had to start again. "You sat at my table, at Christmas. You sat at my table and you never des." Owen's voice was not angry, and that was worse. "I assumed she'd told you. And then it became obvious she hadn't, and it wasn't my business to tell a man something about his own wife. She used a different name." "She used her name," Owen said. "That's a different thing." Desmond said nothing. Outside his window there was a crane turning slowly against a white sky. "I'll tell you what I've thought about for 6 years," Owen said. "And then I'm going to hang up, because I don't want to be cruel and I'm not sure I can manage it. In 1996 you had your hands in a man's chest and you stopped. I wasn't there. But she was, and she was 28, and the field was flooding, and she told you where to put the clamp. A breath, the clamp Des. 20 years later she built a better one. Where do you suppose that idea came from? You've been operating with her hands since you were 29, and you never once turned around to see whose they were." He hung up. Desmond sat in the office he had earned, surrounded by framed things, and understood that his wife had built a company in the garage of the house he paid for, and that 406 hospitals used her invention, and that he had spent the last decade telling audiences he had done it alone. He wanted it to be revenge. He wanted that so badly he could taste it. Revenge would have meant she'd built it because of him, which would have meant he was still standing at the center of it. He drove out to Sterling Road 3 days later, on a Friday without calling. Halyard Medical was on the second floor above a bakery. There was no marble. There was a laminated sign and a buzzer and a stairwell that smelled faintly of bread. The woman at the front desk asked if he had an appointment. He had never in his adult life been asked if he had an appointment. "Tell her Desmond is here," he said, and then heard himself and corrected it. "Tell her Desmond Kavanagh." He waited 8 minutes on a chair that was too low for him. Through the glass wall he could see a long room with a table in it. There were 9 people around that table and Iris was standing at the head of it with a marker in her hand. Somebody was arguing with her. A young woman, gesturing at a screen. Iris listened with her head tilted, the way she used to listen to him at the fold-out table on DuPont. And then she said something short, and the young woman stopped, and then the young woman laughed and started writing. Nobody in that room looked at her the way you look at someone's wife. She came out. She did not seem surprised, and he understood that she had known since the restaurant that he would eventually arrive here, and had simply been waiting for him to be finished with the part where he called her phone. "I have 10 minutes, Iris said. 10 minutes. He had owned her Christmases. He had owned every evening of her adult life. He had 10 minutes. She took him into a small room with a round table and 2 chairs, and she did not sit down, and he understood that too. "I saw the licensing schedule," he said. "I know. Priya told me it went to your clinic. I didn't stop it." "Why not?" "Because it's a good clamp," Iris said, "and your patients should have it." He put his hands on the back of the chair to have something to hold. "How long?" "The drawings 2003. The company, 10 years, she considered. The first one that worked, I finished on a Tuesday in November. You were in Chicago. I remember because I wanted to call you and then I looked at the time difference and thought he's at dinner, he'll be at dinner with people. You could have told me." "Yes, Iris, you could have told me." "I know," she said. "I've thought about that more than you have." He sat down. His legs had made the decision. She stayed standing and the height of it should have felt like an insult and did not. It felt like a fact the way weather is a fact. "I was arrogant," he said. Iris said nothing. "I let people call me brilliant for things you fixed. That night in 96, I've told that story 400 times. And the story has a nurse in it, and I never." His voice went somewhere. He waited for it to come back. "I never said your name, no, and then I brought her to our table." He looked at his hands. 59 years old and steady, finally always steady now, decades too late. "On our anniversary, to the restaurant, you booked." For the first time, Iris looked away. That was the wound. Everything else was old and scarred over. That one was 11 days old. "Why?" she said. "Not a question exactly. You have an entire city to hide in, Desmond. You have money and hotels and a car with tinted windows. Why our table?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Because I didn't have the courage to tell you," he said. "I wanted to be caught. I wanted it done to me instead of by me." He looked up at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and he made no effort to hide it. "That's the most cowardly thing I've ever done, and I've done it to the bravest person I've ever met, and I don't know how to live inside that sentence." Iris folded her arms. Not defensively. To hold herself together. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "It's the truest thing you've said to me in 15 years. Hope came into his face so fast it was terrible to watch. "I can change," he said. "Iris. I'm all ready. I believe you." "Then I believe you," she said. "I just don't believe I have to be standing there while you do it." He shook his head, not disagreeing, trying to make the room stop. "I never wanted you to be smaller," he said. "No," Iris agreed. "You just wanted more space and I was standing in it and I moved, over and over. For 25 years I moved, and you never once noticed you were walking forward." The radiator knocked. Outside the glass someone laughed at a workstation. "You didn't start seeing me," she said. "You started missing me. Those aren't the same and I need you to understand the difference, because if you don't you'll do this again to somebody else." Desmond put his face in his hands. "Is there a chance?" he said. It came out muffled. "Any chance, I'm asking." Iris looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a boy over a drape with a clamp in his fingers. She thought about a hardware store on DuPont. She thought about how completely she had loved him, and how loving him had never once been her mistake. There were a great many chances, she said. He nodded slowly, like a man learning the dimensions of a room he'll be living in for a long time. At the door she stopped. I forgive you, Iris said. I want you to hear that properly, because you'll turn it over later and I don't want you getting it wrong. Forgiveness isn't a door, it's a key I'm handing back. You can go wherever you want with it. Just not toward me. She went back to the table. The young engineer had a new number on the screen and was waiting. Nobody in that room told her to be careful. Sloane Merrick stopped answering his calls sometime in April. She had not meant to end anything. She had assembled him carefully. The way you'd assemble anything valuable. And the assembly had come apart in a restaurant she wasn't even supposed to be in. She had believed she was the reward at the end of a great man's long climb. It took her most of the spring to understand she had been standing at the top of a ladder somebody else had been holding. In June she was promoted and moved to Calgary. She married an engineer 4 years later. She never told him the story. Once at a hospital fundraiser, she saw a photograph of a woman in a navy blazer on a screen at the front of the ballroom, and she left before the presentation. That was all. There was no punishment. There rarely is. There is only the ordinary, permanent knowledge of what you agreed to be part of. Desmond changed, in the way that people actually change, which is unglamorous and does not fix anything. He stopped telling the 1996 story. When a resident asked about it, he said, "There was a nurse in that room. Her name was Iris Sunderland. She held the field and she told me where the clamp went and I would have lost the patient without her." The residents thought this was modesty. It cost him something to be thought modest. He sold the house in Rosedale. He put her workbench, the one from Antigonish, in a crate and had it delivered to Stirling Road and included no note because he'd learned that much. He got old. He got quieter. He put his phone face down at dinners, which nobody noticed because nobody had ever noticed the alternative. 14 months after the anniversary, at the National Cardiovascular Congress in Vancouver, Iris Sunderland gave the closing plenary to 1,100 people. She spoke for 31 minutes about vessel wall mechanics and about the 22 years she'd spent watching Orta's tear at the clamp site. She did not use notes. She was 60 years old and she wore a navy blazer, and she had a piece of chalk-white hair at her temple that Priya had told her to keep. Desmond was in the last row of the balcony. He hadn't registered under his own name. He didn't expect anything. He had driven from the airport in a rental car and he intended to leave before the lights came up. She finished. There was that half-second of quiet. He stood before anyone else in that room did. He stood in the dark with his hands over his head, clapping an old surgeon in a balcony, weeping in a way he'd be embarrassed about at the hotel. She never saw him. That was right. That was as it should be. The applause went on for a long time, and it went to her, and only to her, and it had been waiting to do that for 29 years. Be careful how you weigh a quiet person. Silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is a room where someone is building. The people who carry you when you are frightened will remember the weight long after you have forgotten there was any. Say their names out loud. Say them while they can still hear you. Because when they finally leave, they may not slam the door. They may not shout, or cry, or ask you how you could. They may simply set down what they've been holding, thank you for the years, and walk into a life that was always theirs. And that quiet is the loudest thing you will ever hear. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. Has there ever been a moment when you realized you had to leave in order to be seen? Subscribe to Echoes of Hope 9, and stay with us for more stories about dignity, regret, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again.